Well, for me, there are three extraordinary things about this document, one of which is obvious, two of which are less obvious. Let me mention the less obvious things first. The first is the circumstances under which he chose to write it. Pilecki, in effect, volunteered twice. He volunteered to go to Auschwitz in 1940, and then in 1945, in October, when he was in Italy and therefore safe, he volunteered to go back to what was becoming communist Poland. And that was a decision that actually killed him. He survived the first mission, he didn't survive the second one. And because he was perfectly aware of the risk he was taking, he then wrote out this very long document. So it was precisely his awareness that he was going back into a great risk and that he might not have another chance to write. In other words, precisely this predicament of Poland between German and Soviet power which led him to write. That's the first thing. The second thing which is extraordinary about this document is how far-sighted it was. We, of course, have in our minds the Holocaust. We look at the world and the continent and the history of the 20th century through the idea of the Holocaust. But Pilecki was observing it as it happened, and he was observing it as a Polish patriot. Remember, for him, Poland and its independence is everything. Everything that he does is based upon an extraordinary notion of Polish and personal honor. And for him, his own experience in Auschwitz is just a matter of doing what every Pole should have done. He sets a very high standard for patriotism. But even though his entire self-definition is Polish in this sense, he not only notices the Holocaust, what we now call the Holocaust, but he sees fit to write about it in such a way that every reader will understand how it's different from the suffering of Poles. In 1945, he makes clear that what's happening in 1942 to the Jewish prisoners is quite different from what was happening to the Poles, horrible that was. And he goes to a certain effort in 1945 to make sure that any future reader of this report will understand what the Holocaust was. I think that's rather extraordinary. We, reading it in 2012, can almost take this for granted. But in 1945, he was doing something which not everyone would have done, on the contrary. And then the other thing which is obvious about this, and which Dr. Sitkiewicz is much more qualified to comment upon than I am, is the simple description of Auschwitz as a camp and as a death facility. We have few, if any, descriptions that compare to this one, and therefore it's a priceless document.